Good morning, brothers and sisters. Hope everybody's doing well today on a day that feels like we've got a little bit of winter. And my kudos to the musicians over here. I could have listened to a little more Miles Davis this morning. Um, you know, uh, I've spoken here a few times, and I think I know what the values are in this building and of all the people in this building. And when I was thinking about kind of where we are right now, this January, next Monday, a week from tomorrow. We've got really, I think, a pretty symbolic uh, set of choices about who we are as a nation. Because on the one hand, it's Inauguration Day, and on the other hand, it's Martin Luther King Day. And those are really, to me, that's pretty poignant as I've been thinking about this. And as I've been talking to people over the past few weeks, and I'm sure you have too, I've seen this a lot on social media. I know that a lot of people are deeply worried about what this last election meant, about who we are as Americans, right? We had a majority of voters. I don't need to tell you this stuff, right? But seem to support the idea of anti-LGBTQ, anti-trans ideas, real scapegoating, really, I think, frightening stuff. Xenophobia, racism, empowering the wealthiest people in this country, right? All those things seem to be what Americans voted for in this election. And I promise I'm not going to talk all about the election, but I think it's important for us to think about this as a problem. And on the other hand, again, we've got Martin Luther King Day, which we heard about Dr. King's dream, and really, I think that holiday, Martin Luther King Day, it's not just a day to honor King, it's a day to honor the civil rights movement, and more importantly than that, it's a day that really, I think sometimes we talk about King Day as if it's a day only for African Americans in this country, but it's really not. It's a day for all of us. It's a day for all of us to reflect on the social justice tradition in the United States, right? So, what I want to tell you is that, first of all, the election was very close. Okay, it was about 2 million votes when you add it all up. And in Wisconsin, it's about 60,000 votes. That's fewer people than you can fit in Lambeau Field, right? It's not a lot of people. And we often think about elections in a very like dichotomous way. I mean, of course they are. They're binary, right? But instead of thinking about just this last election, let's think about the last three elections, where in each of those presidential elections, the effective incumbent lost. Right, in 2016, Hillary Clinton was the effective incumbent. Trump himself was the incumbent in 2020, and he lost. And then, of course, Kamala Harris was the effective incumbent this time, and she lost. And I think what that tells me is that Americans, not all of them, there are some deeply troubling things that some of those voters support. But the Americans that swing elections, it's about, I don't know, 10 million people or something. They're voting desperately for something to change because we have a situation in this country that is deeply unsustainable. I don't need to tell you all what it's like. We have about half of Americans believe that they're living paycheck to paycheck. The crisis in housing is rampant, and I see some of y'all kind of affirming with your eyes or by nodding. We've got people that can't afford rents. We've got people that can't afford to buy housing when 20 or 30 years ago they would have been able to do that. And so this conversation about inflation and gas prices, it might seem a little bit simplistic, but what people were actually saying is we deserve lives that are sustainable, where we have a future where we know that we can feed our kids, that we can have a decent place to live, that we can have good health care. And we're going to keep voting for different people until something happens to change that. Okay. And I would argue that as much as we might not like what the votes of some of those people represented, that's a part of the American tradition, a big part of the American tradition. Okay. And I think that's what it means to be an American, is to push for change and to push to uphold the promise of American democracy. So let's talk about that for just a minute. And let me tell you what I think is the real story of American democracy. Okay. So you heard in the little film clip there, Dr. King talk about the promise in the American Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. There's more to that, though, obviously, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, we've all heard those words so many times that they probably seem kind of trite, but I want you to remember that when Thomas Jefferson, who has all kinds of contradictions, right? Well, you all know that, and they were men who wrote those ideas. In that context, they were living in a world with a king, right? They were living in a world where the king basically decided, you know, that things that the government would do based on his whims. Sometimes a queen, but mostly a king. And what those revolutionaries said is, we are not going to operate that way anymore. We're going to operate from the principle that we set things up to enable ordinary people. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That kind of covers it, actually, right? Those are all everything that we all need to live good lives falls in that framework. And to say that governments are instituted to make sure we have those things. It might seem pretty simple, but it's actually a very radical promise. And I would argue that the story of American history since that point is of Americans pushing for our nation to uphold that promise, to push for that very democratic promise. Okay? So you can take this into the early 1800s when working men, and they were mostly men, formed unions and pushed to eliminate, in the very early days after the revolution, there were actually property requirements to vote in most states, almost every state. And working men and their organizations pushed to eliminate those property requirements and to open the doors for everybody to be able to vote, whether they were rich or not. And then, of course, in the 1840s and 1850s, Americans increasingly grappled with the institution of slavery and the obvious contradiction that if all men are created equal, how do you justify buying and selling literal human beings to enrich plantation owners in the South? And so, maybe the most famous of these abolitionists was a man named Frederick Douglass, who liberated himself from slavery. And in the 1850s, when there was a lot of debate over how to end slavery, and you actually had white abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison saying, like publicly burning the Constitution and saying the Constitution was a deal with the devil. There's no way that we can end slavery without basically like starting over. Douglass said no. He was part of the group that was saying no, like actually we're going to find our liberation in the promise of American democracy. Okay, so I have the Declaration part memorized. I don't have all these other speeches memorized. So I do have a couple of quotes here that I just want to make sure I get the language right. But Douglass, in a very famous speech in 1852 called "What to the Slave is the Fourth of July," which you've probably heard on the Fourth of July, it gets sort of quoted often. He starts off by saying, "What to the slave? What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham." Okay, those are pretty damning words, right? But we often don't remember the end of the speech, which is where Douglass concludes that the Constitution, and these are his exact words, is a glorious liberty document. And I want you to think about this, right? Douglass was a man who was beaten and tortured by what was called a slave breaker, okay, and ended up getting his freedom because he basically beat him in a fight and then escaped, okay. But this is a man who had that experience, who actually had a price on his head when he was actually giving this speech in 1852 by Southern slaveholders who wanted to recapture him. And he said, allow me to say, in conclusion, this is the end of the speech, obviously, which he gave at a church. Notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. So when I think about everything that's happened the past few weeks, and I think about what it means to be an American, To have somebody in Douglas's position say that the promise of American democracy is what's going to liberate us, and that's what it means to be a true American, I take a lot of solace in that. And of course, Douglas was proven right, okay, in the 1860s, when it took a war to end slavery, which Douglas was pushing for, by the way, and led to what, Lincoln called a new birth of freedom, right? Saving a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, okay? In the late 19th century, we saw the rise of enormous corporate interests that put pressure on workers. That, I don't need to tell you all this story probably, but children working in factories, when people got hurt on the job in these factories that provided enormous wealth to people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, they were just thrown out onto the street. These employers, these businesses, they went to war on unions. They hired company thugs to basically stop workers from organizing for a better life. And workers continue to organize in that framework. Everybody from Eugene Debs, who started off as he actually continued to be an evangelical Christian, but he was an evangelical Christian and a railroad worker from Indiana, became a socialist after being thrown in jail for leading the Pullman strike in 1894. Well, it was while he was in jail that he became radicalized, because he basically said, we have to overthrow capitalism if we're going to have workers' rights in this country. Everybody from Debs to Margaret Haley, a teacher in Chicago. She taught in the schools that you read about in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, who organized the first teacher union in the country. And basically, this was an all-female teacher union. They organized for pensions. They took on some of the biggest tax delinquents in the state, actually, in the city, saying, like, they have to pay their taxes if we're going to have the schools that our kids need. So the labor movement, the women's rights movement, right? Take it back to 1848 in Seneca Falls, when they unveiled the women and men there too. Actually, Douglas was at Seneca Falls, who pushed for a different Declaration of Independence that argued that all men and women are created equal. Through Alice Paul in the 19-teens and 1920s, who pushed for women's suffrage. And Paul actually went so far as to push for an equal rights amendment to the Constitution. She was jailed and force-fed while she was in jail because she was on a hunger strike. The 1930s, when you have workers, all those workers that were organized in the 1880s and 90s, it took 50 years to get things like minimum wage laws and the actual right to organize in the administration of FDR in the 1930s, right? FDR, in his re-election campaign in 1936, in fact, argued that there was essentially a battle between ordinary people who believed in democracy and what he called the economic royalists. He said if in 1776 we had to fight the king and hereditary royalists, we fought economic royalists in the 1930s. And corporations hated him, right? They hated FDR. There were even efforts to overthrow the government because they hated the democratic push that was coming from unions and from FDR and Democrats in the 1930s. FDR's presidency culminated in a call for even an economic bill of rights, things that we would definitely all agree with today. The idea that we should have the right to an education, the right to housing and health care, and the right to a job. These were all things FDR called for. And the years that followed that saw the efforts of all kinds of activists, women's rights activists, anti-war activists, but most prominently civil rights activists. King, of course, at the forefront. But I want you to think about all of the other, slightly lesser known people like Rosa Parks, Rosa Parks wasn't just tired one day, by the way. She was an activist. And the NAACP was challenging segregation when she decided, when she took that stand in Montgomery. And the Montgomery boycott took over a year to win desegregation in that city. So not only Parks, but think about the thousands of African Americans who hitchhiked, carpooled, or walked to work for a year for that level of human dignity. And when you're feeling down about where we are now, think about the civil rights protesters crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, in 1965, knowing that white supremacist thugs were standing on the other side of that bridge, ready to beat them as they had many times before in Alabama. That's the true history of what it means to be an American. It's not hatred, it's not exclusion, it's not getting as much property as you can and then putting your boot on someone else's neck, right? It's not Elon Musk. I'm telling you, it's definitely not Elon Musk. Okay? It is it is social justice. It is democracy. It is saying that we deserve to have the lives that are going to be good, that are going to make sure we have the things that we need: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And since we're talking about King, I'll conclude with him. His "I Have a Dream" speech was a great speech, right? It's the most well-known speech, and it's what we all remember on King Day. But I want to make sure that you know about the really more radical version of King that I think very much adhered to the promise of American democracy. So first of all, 1963, the March on Washington. The full title for the March on Washington was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Jobs were central. The civil rights movement, as King and Bayard Rustin, I don't know if you know the Netflix documentary or the Netflix movie that just came out, and another collaborator named A. Philip Randolph, who's a veteran labor leader. They organized the March on Washington. And the argument was basically that it's not enough for people just to, African Americans, to be able to, have desegregated public accommodations and be able to vote if they didn't have the dignity that came with economic security. Jobs, higher minimum wage, union rights, those were always central to the civil rights movement. And many of you probably know this, maybe you don't though. When King was murdered by a white supremacist in Memphis in 1968, he was there to support striking sanitation workers in the city of Memphis. Now, all those workers were black, so it was obviously a civil rights issue. But those workers were trying to organize. They were organizing a union because their working conditions were so awful. The strike actually started because one of the sanitation workers got killed by faulty equipment that the white supremacist city administration would not upgrade. So this was a strike literally for their lives. And they won that strike, actually. I mean, King's presence there was important, but really the organizing they did is what made it happen. And so I want to finish by quoting from a speech that King gave actually a year to the day before his death in 1967. This was April 4th, 1967, at a church in New York City. And in this speech, King publicly came out against the Vietnam War. And he said, I can't be silent about this anymore. I have to come out against this, not just because of the damage that the war was doing to civilians in Vietnam, but what the damage it was doing to the civil rights movement in the United States, the damage it was doing to the promise of economic security. In fact, he even says in the speech that one of the reasons that we can't have things like the right to a job and these other proposals that King and some of his collaborators had pushed for in something called the Freedom Budget a year before is because of the time and energy that was going to the Vietnam War. And so in this speech, King basically, it's a very famous speech, but you might not have heard it recently. It's really, really good. And he concludes by saying that he uses the parable of the Good Samaritan, which I'm guessing most of you know. But if not, the Good Samaritan, right, was there was a traveler who was badly beaten, and the Good Samaritan basically went out of their way. This was to help this person on a very narrow road called the Jericho Road, right, which was a very dangerous road for people to travel. That's the parable of the story. And King uses that parable to talk about what we actually need. Okay, and he says it's great to give money to a beggar. That's really important. But he says, I'm convinced that if we are going to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical, he says radical, revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented, picture King is saying this, not me, he's more exciting, from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on the roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day, we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. The compassion is true compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. So when you're thinking about King and his legacy, that's the legacy, right? It's great to say I have a dream, and of course we all agree with that. But it's what does it actually take to get there? And that's what it means to be an American. To look at the promise that we've set for ourselves, and as imperfect as it is, and with all the contradictions, we don't say, no, we're going to throw it all out and try to, and try to get what we have for ours. We're going to work together to build a society in which men and women are truly created equal, and in which all of our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are part of our premise for operating every day. So I hope, like Frederick Douglass and me, I'm in this camp too, that you're not despairing of our country. Because we have everything we need with the American promise to fight for the country that we need. But it doesn't just happen, right? We are going to have to put the work in. Whatever that means to you, some of you might want to get involved in politics, some of you might not. But I would suggest that basic acts of human solidarity, being here, of course, but helping neighbors, helping people in your professional lives, standing in solidarity with people when they need it. The next few years, everybody from immigrants to the trans community are going to need all of us to stand in solidarity with them, whatever that means. Whether that's something you do publicly or whether that's a private act that you do to show compassion or help, now's the time to step up. And if you want to be a true American, those are the acts that we need to engage in. That's how you show that you're a true American. And I really do believe that, and I hope that you're with me. Thank you.